Hi there. In the last lesson, we said that all foods eaten or taken in by an animal can be classified or divided into 7 groups of food substances. These include carbohydrates, proteins, fats and oils, vitamins, mineral salts, water, and roughages. In this lesson, we'll be discussing carbohydrates in detail. I am sure you must have heard of carbohydrates before. Can you list some food substances that are carbohydrates? Did you say rice, yam, maize, millet, potatoes, bread, and/or cassava? If you did, good. But come to think of it, why do we call this food carbohydrates? It is because these foods are basically made up of substances called carbohydrates. So, what are carbohydrates? Let us break down the term so you can understand it better. Carbohydrate is a combination of 2 words, carbon and hydrate. You know what carbon is? It's an element, while hydrate means containing water or addition of water. Therefore, the word carbohydrate loosely means hydrate of carbon. You remember water contains the elements hydrogen and oxygen in the ratio 2:1. Let us combine all these information so we can get the actual definition of carbohydrates. We can define carbohydrates as any substance that contains carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms in the ratio 1:2:1. Carbohydrates are represented by the general formula CX, bracket open, H2O, bracket close, Y, where X represents the number of carbon atoms, and it can range from 6 to thousands, and Y represents the proportion of hydrogen and oxygen. But take note, not all foods which contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are carbohydrates. Only food that contains these elements in the ratio 1:2:1. Examples of food that meet this requirement are bread, cassava, and maize, as we mentioned earlier. Carbohydrates are often referred to as saccharides, which means sugar, and they are of different types. There are 3 common types of carbohydrates, and these are monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. We will go through these types one after the other. Let us start with monosaccharides. Mono means 1, and you already know saccharide means sugar. Therefore, monosaccharides are carbohydrates with 1 sugar. They are often called simple sugars. In fact, monosaccharides are the simplest forms of carbohydrates. Most have a general formula of C6H12O6. The very common glucose is a monosaccharide. Other examples include fructose and galactose. The second class of carbohydrates are disaccharides. Di means 2, and saccharide means sugar. Therefore, disaccharides are carbohydrates with 2 sugars. Disaccharides are made up of 2 monosaccharides and have the general formula of C12H22O11. A common example of disaccharides is sucrose. Sucrose is our common table sugar. It is made up of 2 monosaccharides, glucose and fructose. Lactose is another example of disaccharides. It is made up of 2 monosaccharides, glucose and galactose. Do you know where we can find lactose? In milk. Another example of disaccharide is maltose. Maltose is made up of 2 glucose units. We can find maltose in our very tasty malt drinks. The last class of carbohydrates we will discuss is the polysaccharides. The prefix poly means many. Hence, polysaccharides are carbohydrates with many sugars. Polysaccharides can contain up to 1,000 units of monosaccharides joined together. They have the general formula, bracket open, C6H12O6, bracket close, N, where N can be a high number like 40 or even 3,000. Polysaccharides often serve as a mode of storage of monosaccharides in living organisms. One example is starch. Starch is a polymer of glucose that is made up of hundreds to thousands of glucose units. It is found in plant tissues like yam tubers, potatoes, and so on. It is also the starch used to stiffen shirts during ironing. Glycogen is another example. Glycogen is called animal starch because it is formed from glucose molecules as starch is, but only found in animals. Glycogen is made up of repeated units of glucose in 100 to 1,000 subunits. Cellulose is yet another example of polysaccharides. You've definitely heard of cellulose in the cellulose cell wall in plants. It is a special type of glucose polymer which is more complex in arrangement than starch and glycogen. This complex structure gives plant cell walls the tensile strength we mentioned in our earlier lessons on plant cells. We have carefully studied the different types of carbohydrates. Let us discuss what makes them so important to living organisms. The primary role of carbohydrates to living organisms is to generate energy for the cell. Remember how glucose is used to generate ATP during respiration? Good. Another importance of carbohydrates is their use in building certain body parts, like the exoskeletons of arthropods such as spiders and scorpions. Some important biomolecules in the cell, like DNA and ATP, and even the cell membrane, are made up of carbohydrates. I'm sure you can see how important these carbohydrates are. Let us do a little recap. We said carbohydrates are substances containing carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in the ratio 1:2:1, and they can be classified into monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. In the next lesson, we will be discussing another class of food called proteins. See you then.